Welcome to the Cedar Park United podcast. Last week we heard some plain speaking from Jesus, blessings for the poor, hungry, grieving, and persecuted. To those who are socially well-positioned, a challenge to wake up and pay attention. When the things that give us stability and control fall away, how will we respond? Today, we sit together with the discomfort of Jesus' next words. Love your enemies. It sounds simple, but living it's complicated. Jesus invites us into a love that goes beyond what's easy or expected. A love that stretches us and transforms how we see others, ourselves, and even God. Candidate Minister Jessica Gauthier invites us to see that it's not about past answers, but about growing in compassion, mercy, and grace.
I want to start with a little bit of music. It's something that's been on my mind this week. In Orlando Gibbons' beautiful choral anthem, "This is the Record of John," there's a moment where the alto soloist sings that John the Baptist said plainly, "I am not the Christ." The text comes directly from the Gospel of John, where religious leaders, they're trying to figure out John's agenda. And they ask if he's the Messiah, the one they've been waiting for. Those questions will get asked of Jesus too, right? And John answers, "I am not the Christ." Seemingly simple, straightforward denial. But in Gibbons' setting, right on the word plainly, the music swirls into a cascade of ornate and complicated notes. It's anything but plain. Listen. And said plainly, "I am not the Christ." Not plain, right? It's almost like Gibbons is trying to say that when something sounds simple, it might be deeply complicated. And maybe John's denial wasn't as easy as it sounds. Maybe it carried weight or tension or even confusion. Sometimes what seems plain on the surface is layered with meaning underneath. And here's another example. In Handel's Messiah, the tenor soloist sings those famous words from the prophet Isaiah. "Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill made low, the crooked straight, and the rough places plain." And Christian tradition has long read this passage as a prophecy about what the coming of the Messiah will bring. A world where barriers are leveled and God's love reaches everyone. But again, there's irony in the music. Just before the tenor sings the word plain, there is a jagged, twisting line full of musical ups and downs. The tenor says, "And the rough place is plain." That's not plain. That's not plain. The rough places are supposed to be smoothed out, but the music is anything but smooth. So Handel is musically reminding us that even the process of making things plain can feel complicated. Last Sunday, Revi offered us some plain speaking. She took us to level ground with Jesus, a place where he spoke to people of all sorts together at the same time and named blessings and warnings. "Blessed are you who are poor, hungry, grieving, persecuted, but be warned, when you find yourself with wealth, resources, comfort, and secure social or political standing, you're going to have some choices to make." It was blunt, unsettling, and honest. No sugarcoating. No softening. I mean Jesus, not Revi. Jesus wasn't interested in that. He was interested in the truth. And I think That sermon on the plain must have been such a hard sermon for Jesus to prepare. A preacher always wants to know as much as possible about the people who are going to hear the message, right? Because when the group is diverse, like this one, it's really complicated. Everybody hears something different. Everybody walks away from the sermon with a different idea of what's the main message. Even in the directness that Jesus gave us on the sermon on the plain, things are not really that simple, because it's easy to think, well, I'm in the blessed category, right? Or I'm not the one being warned. Like, I'm not really rich, or I'm not really, comfortable, or yeah, I sure felt persecuted when that person was tailing me on the highway. I think, though, that we can be both blessed and warned at the same time. We can be both the one who hungers and the one who hoards. And that's where love comes into this whole mess, because love asks us to sit with ourselves, sit with God, sit with others in that messy, complicated space. And it invites us to resist the urge to rush to judgment or oversimplify or give our own solutions. My work as a spiritual care provider, this often for me means biting my tongue, like literally, instead of offering my solutions to a patient. Because a person needs to find their own answers, their own meaning, and I'm only there to facilitate that process. So even if I think I do have the answers, it's not going to help the person to get them pre-digested from me. They have to do that work for themselves. So love is asking us to stay grounded in compassion even when it's hard, and even when we don't have all the answers, and even when it's not our place to provide them. And now you're going to start scratching your heads a little bit, and you're going to think to yourself something, if you haven't already, and you're going to be right. So I'm just going to say it. All my sermons this season, every single one, have been about love in one way or another, and about love that makes us squirm and isn't easy. There's not a single one that hasn't been about that, is there? So during Advent, on Peace Sunday, I talked about how peace isn't about keeping things calm or avoiding conflict. Sometimes love means stirring the pot, naming the hard truths, not to create drama, but to move towards healing. And love needs to be active, not passive. And then on Epiphany Sunday, with our star words, we explored the many-sided wisdom of God from Ephesians. It's like a diamond with countless facets, and this love shines through cultures and traditions and experiences that we may not understand. And so love, in that sense, it's expansive, but it's impossible to fully comprehend and requires humility. And then on Baptism Sunday, the Sunday after, it was about belonging and how baptism names us as beloved before we've done anything to earn it. So that kind of love is simple, and yet it's so hard to really believe, especially if we're weighed down by shame and fear or feelings of unworthiness. And then a couple of weeks ago, looking at 1 Corinthians 13, the famous love poem, we heard about it again. It's patient, it's kind, it's not boastful or rude. And also, Paul says, now we see through a glass dimly. We're always just learning how to love, right? It's like putting on glasses for the first time, or with a new prescription, things might look clearer, but it takes time to adjust. We stumble, so we get dizzy. We get it wrong, especially when we're wearing those progressives. I still have to look down when I'm going down the steps. And now today, there's a hard part again. And Jesus says, love your enemies. And I think that sounds pretty noble, doesn't it? Love my enemies. But who is my enemy? And suddenly I am feeling like that lawyer asking Jesus before he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, who is my neighbor? It feels almost like the same question. Who is my enemy? Because sometimes enemies seem really obvious. They're the people who have hurt us, or they're the ones we deeply disagree with. But it's not always so clear. I'm thinking of that very familiar expression, which I have used several times. I'm my own worst enemy. And I'm wondering how often we sabotage ourselves holding on to a really toxic self-image or staying stuck in fear. And what about how we see God? Like sometimes we carry around really harmful images of God. God as a distant judge, always angry and disappointed in us. And that distorted perception can become an enemy to our spiritual growth. It can hold us back from love and grace and cause us to judge ourselves and each other harshly. It can shut the door to compassion. So our enemies do not only include those who openly oppose us. We might see people who challenge us as enemies. We might see them that way because they're challenging us. Or maybe the parts of ourselves that we dislike or struggle with, or that we see in other people reflected back to us. I hate it when that happens. And the distorted images of God that keep us trapped in fear and judgment, well, they can become a confusing enemy indeed. So we muddle along without the whole picture, and we're walking along, and everyone is a potential enemy or a potential friend. And then this teaching in Luke's gospel that we heard the first part of goes even deeper than what Jennifer read for us just now, because I cut the verses just following that are in our lectionary reading, because I wanted to look at that first part. But then right after verse 31, Jesus sharpens the challenge and he asks some questions. His style is rhetorical, kind of like the gibbons in the handle. It's like he's talking as though we already know the answer. But the answer knocks me back because he says, if you love those who love you, well, how is that any sign of God's free grace working in your life? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, well, how is that any indication that God's transforming grace is at work in you? Because even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you're expecting eventual repayment, well, how does that reflect the gift of God's unearned grace? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be paid back in full. Where is God's transforming grace in our actions? It's not about earning human approval, not even each other's approval in this wonderful community of faith. It's not. It's about reflecting divine generosity, love that mirrors God's grace. It's not a transactional thing. It does not expect anything in return. It gives freely. It doesn't worry about what other people are going to think. And this flips my sense of fairness right upside down. It's like the Lord's Prayer, like, forgive us as we forgive those who sin against us. There's this cycle that's happening. It's not the oppressed forgiving the oppressor only, but it's the oppressor, in turn, learning to love and forgive also. So I think we sit on both sides of that equation. We might see ourselves as victims when actually we're the ones with power and we're judging and withholding grace. We might see ourselves with agency and power when actually we've got like a really big blind spot, like a log in our eye or something. And this is where the many-sided wisdom of God may come back to help us. because our vision is incomplete. We don't see the whole picture, but God does. And God's love is both exceedingly simple and as complex as those twisting musical lines I mentioned earlier. God's love holds all those contradictions and the messiness and still calls us beloved. So, what is love? Baby, don't hurt me no more. I'm unmasking for you all. I had to do it. Love is knowing someone and accepting them and seeking the best for them and from them, even when that someone is yourself, and even when that someone is hard to love. So we're closing this Epiphany season and heading toward Lent, and I just want to invite all of us to sit with the complexity and to trust that God's love holds it all and holds us all. God's love sees us, and God's love knows us, and God's love accepts us, and God's love wants only the good for us and is actively working for that. And maybe that's enough for today. Thanks be to God.